All right, welcome back. New York Times versus the United States. All right, the context for this case is once again we were looking at how the Bill of Rights is being continually interpreted to balance the power of government and civil liberties of individuals. All right, so the facts of this case: the Nixon administration attempted to stop publication of the Pentagon Papers. Pentagon Papers are a 7,000-page classified study of the history of U.S. activities in Vietnam. And it was attempting to be published by the New York Times and Washington Post. So somebody had leaked this from the Defense Department to the New York Times and Washington Post, and essentially it showed that the Vietnam War was going much more poorly than the administration was telling the public. It expressed the doubts that high-level strategists within the Defense Department and the military had about the chances of victory in Vietnam at all. And essentially the Nixon administration wanted to stop this from being published because they realized that this was going to be very, very bad for them politically. So the question is, did the federal government's attempt to block publication of, quote, classified information, end quote, violate the First Amendment? So they said that this information was classified, this is part of a Defense Department report, and it could not be made public. So they sued to stop the publication of these materials. The holding by the Supreme Court is that the government did not have the right to block publication of the Pentagon Papers, allowing them to be published. The constitutional principle that was used to support such a decision in which they allowed the Pentagon Papers to be published by the New York Times and Washington Post says because of the First Amendment's freedom of press, there is a heavy presumption against the constitutional validity of government claims of prior restraint. All right, there's a lot to unpack in that. There's a heavy presumption against the constitutional validity of government claims of prior restraint. In other words, because of freedom of the press, when the Supreme Court is going to hear a case with the government claiming that it needs to suppress that freedom of the press, it says that there is a heavy presumption against the validity of that argument. So essentially this is going to be something that is very difficult for the government to prove that this is a case where freedom of the press should actually be suppressed, should be nullified, should be voided. So that means that usually in this type of case, the Supreme Court is telling us that they are going to rule in favor of freedom of the press. It also mentions government claims of prior restraint. That's essentially another term for censorship. So you'd probably do well to define that for yourself, because I don't think very many of us use that term prior restraint commonly. But essentially it's referring to rules about what can or cannot be published. And so again, this is telling us that they are going to, by and large, they want to rule in favor of freedom of the press. Key quotes from the Concurring Opinions. So this is not a majority opinion, but this gets into kind of technical details. Because this was a time-sensitive case, being that New York Times and Washington Post were publishing these things, and the Nixon administration was trying to make them stop, the Supreme Court had to rule quickly. So a per curiam opinion is a brief, unsigned opinion. So it doesn't say who's writing this opinion. This is a brief opinion on behalf of the entire court, and you'll see we'll have some concurring opinions momentarily. So this is the decision. This is the ruling of the court. The one that has legal grounds is this one. And it essentially says, again, that quote just described in the constitutional principle: any system of prior restraints of expression come to this court bearing a heavy presumption against its constitutional validity. The government had not met this burden. So again, the government has to make a very compelling case to show why they should be able to stop or limit this freedom of expression, and they were unable to do so. From the concurring opinions, this is saying that the executive branch seems to have forgotten the essential purpose and history of the First Amendment, which is, or they go on to say that the guarding of military and diplomatic secrets at the expense of an informed representative government provides no real security for our republic. So they are trying to claim that this was, national security and classified information, so the people couldn't know it. And the Supreme Court is rejecting that argument and saying, yeah, but keeping those secrets will keep the people uninformed, and that doesn't make them any more free or secure anyway. A dissenting opinion acknowledges the fact that the First Amendment is not absolute, so there are allowed to be limitations, and the justice here references the case from long ago where Justice Holmes pointed out, saying that the right to shout fire in a crowded theater didn't exist if there wasn't a fire. So he's just pointing out, listen, this right isn't absolute, it can be limited, and this would be a reasonable limitation that the Nixon administration wants to put on it. All right, again, don't forget, subscribe, hit that like button for me if this video helped you at all. Until next time, this has been a Money Production.